just tell Richard.
I will. So he just needs like a minute.
Yeah.
That should give us satisfaction.
Good evening. Welcome. And welcome to what is always a very special event for the IWM, the Jan Patočka Memorial Lecture. And for this special event, we always want special speakers. And I hope we won't be disappointing you in that this evening. Let me briefly explain what we're going to do over the course of the evening. I will introduce our speaker briefly, and he will then talk for roughly between, I think, 45, 50 minutes, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, before I ask him a couple of questions on the back of his lecture, and then I will throw it open to the audience for questions. And after that, I cordially invite you all downstairs for wine and cheese, or as we say in England, drinks and nibbles. So, as I said, this is a special event for us, and Jan-Werner Müller is certainly a special speaker and a special guest. He is Roger William Strauss Professor of Social Sciences at Princeton, where he also leads the program in political philosophy. Now, I could spend another 20 minutes talking of his achievements and his previous posts, but he's asked me to keep it short, and so I will keep it short. Just to say, you can regularly read his contributions to the London Review of Books, the MYRB, Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, and so on. And he usually sends me a notification about once a week of something which he says may be of interest, and it always is of interest. The title of his talk tonight is "What Was Christian Democracy?" Which to me is rather like telling the punchline before you give the joke beforehand, because he seems to suggest there is now a question mark behind it, but when I first saw it, there was no question mark. So maybe Christian democracy is more alive than I was initially led to believe, but I'm sure Jan-Werner Müller will now explain to us whether it's alive or dead and what it was. Jan-Werner, please take the podium.
Thank you, Misha, for this very kind and mercifully short introduction. If I may, I'll come closer to the people, although I'll be rudely turning my back to you. Forgive me for that. I want to actually thank everybody at the EWM for inviting me to join a list of very distinguished colleagues who have given this lecture in memory of Jan Patočka, in particular Ludger Hagedorn. Great thanks for having me here tonight. My remarks concern the question how various Christians, and Catholics in particular, have tried to make democracy safe for religion. I'll decode that cryptic formulation in just a second, but first of all, I'll tell you that my talk will come in 3 chapters. I will first try to outline what kind of problem these Christians and especially Catholics had with modern democracy, and then say a few words about 3 strategies which they devised in the course of the 19th century to make democracy safe for religion. In the second chapter, we move into the 20th century, where versions of these 3 strategies are also going to be visible. And then in the third chapter, I'll say something about our situation today and try to engage with the question, what, if anything, really remains of Christian democracy? And then there will also be a somewhat depressing dialogue where I run a bit of a risk because I will try to draw on Jan Patočka's thought, and I fear that some in the audience might find this incredibly crude, but I hope that will help us to open a discussion for after the lecture. All right, on to the first chapter. Like with so many other things in modern history, the French Revolution was, of course, a major caesura for Catholics. It posed the question to them how exactly they were going to relate to modern representative government. And more particularly, it posed the question to those who were broadly in agreement with what famously Alexis de Tocqueville claimed in the early 19th century. Namely that in the modern world, democracy was actually inevitable. It was going to happen in one form or another. The question was how to come to terms with it, how to moderate it, and maybe how to manage it. Now, what exactly was the challenge if you were a religious actor around the year 1800 or so? Well, allow me to distinguish two and then setting aside one of these two challenges. You might say that at a very basic moral psychological level, democracy always comes with a suggestion that we can engage in collective and maybe even individual self-determination, that we together can control our own fate. And for some people, of course, this is a form of hubris. This is a sign of human pride and ultimately sinfulness. So that's one challenge one can look at, and I'm happy to talk about it later if you like. But I want to concentrate on the second one. The second one is more, if you like, philosophical/institutional. It has something to do with the character of democracy as what our famous Polish colleague Adam Przeworski has called institutionalized uncertainty. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the basic idea is very simple. Democracy means that you generally cannot and should not foresee political outcomes. Meanwhile, the procedures we use to arrive at these outcomes should be predictable, stable, foreseeable. In autocracies, of course, it's exactly the other way around. Nobody needs to kind of speculate about who wins presidential elections in Russia, but the procedures can always be changed. And if you just think back, for instance, to 2018, when Navalny was actually launching a serious challenge, they kept fiddling with the procedures literally up until the very last minute. So that's what institutionalized uncertainty refers to. But notice how, in a certain way, it poses a challenge. You, if you participate in democracy, might become complicit in a process where majorities are empowered, who fundamentally go in their decisions against your interests or maybe even against your most cherished values and principles. Long story short, democracy inevitably is a certain kind of risk. And this is what these thinkers that I'll be looking at were very concerned about. Of course, they could have, in a sense, gotten rid of the risk if they had done what, as you all know, plenty of other Catholic thinkers in the 19th and 20th century did, which is to say, let's just opt for an authoritarian solution, where we're on the safe side. Just think of the 20th century. Of course, you were going to be on the safe side if you simply opted for something like Franco's Spain or Salazar's Portugal. But the people I'm interested in didn't want to go down that route. They did want to come to terms with democracy, but they also sought to fashion strategies of how to reduce the risks that come with democracy. And I want to suggest that already in the 19th century, we see three strategies emerging. The first one, very straightforwardly, has to do with the idea that if the people themselves, the demos, if you like, is still reliably Christian, and maybe Catholic in particular, then the risk of undesirable outcomes is going to be significantly reduced. This is an idea that many people already hit on early in the 19th century. In fact, in France, I'm talking about those who are sometimes grouped together with the label Catholic liberals, although I think it's fair to say they weren't particularly liberal, really. But they certainly sought to, as one of them, Lamennais, put it, they sought to baptize the revolution. They sought to appropriate modern democracy, but with the idea that you had to make sure that the people themselves remained, if you like, as Christian as possible. The other famous name in this group that you will recognize, of course, is Tocqueville. And here maybe it's worth making a somewhat pedantic point. People sometimes say, oh yeah, Tocqueville. Of course, he said that, you know, democracy was flourishing in America because there was some elective affinity between Protestantism and democracy. He didn't say that at all. His argument was there's an elective affinity between Catholicism and democracy. And of course he was saying that because he wasn't writing for Americans, as everybody knows, he was writing for the audience back in France. And what was his argument? His argument was that a life of freedom is really a difficult one. So many choices, so many opportunities for chaos and disorientation. You need something like a stable foundation or a kind of fixed point that anchors you. And once you have that, then a life of freedom becomes possible. And of course, he basically suggested that the great thing about Catholicism was that it provided this fixed point, such that he would even in the end say, Catholics in the US are both the most obedient and the most independent citizens at the same time, which is a very interesting, maybe somewhat paradoxical claim to make. But it goes back to the same idea that democracy can work if the people themselves are sufficiently Christian. That's one strategy. The second one basically comes down to saying, the people, come on. Fallen humanity, sinful individuals, you cannot possibly bet on them. You need to constrain the people, and you need to constrain them with institutions that bear a recognizably Christian or maybe even directly Catholic imprint. And my witness, so to speak, for this approach is somebody who has a really terrible reputation in the history of ideas. It's another, well, he wasn't certainly speaking French, he was Sardinian. It's Joseph de Maistre. Some of you may recognize the name from some of the writings of Isaiah Berlin, who famously or maybe infamously said, Maistre basically prefigures 20th century fascism. And to be sure, he wrote plenty of things that don't sound very nice. But he was a complicated thinker, and one of his relatively neglected books was on the papacy. And compared to some of the other stuff he wrote, it's certainly very clear and very sane. And it came down to the idea that the papacy could actually provide something like a supranational structure for Europe to constrain individual nation states, and to basically make sure that sinful humanity and the individual sinful peoples of Europe did not deviate too much from a certain basic moral understanding as suggested by Catholicism. So don't bet on the people, bet on constraints on the people. And then thirdly, the strategy that you probably have been expecting already, it's the most well-known one, of course, it's the foundation of political parties, the parties that we still today know as Christian democratic parties. But note that this is actually a relatively late development. This only happens later in the 19th century. And it's maybe worth reiterating a point that was famously made by a colleague in political science, Tatis Kalevas, many, many moons ago already. He basically pointed out these parties originated as defensive institutions. They arose in countries where secular states were, in a very aggressive way, to put it bluntly, going after Catholics. They were more or less like interest group formations. And when they talked of things like the people, das Volk, Popolo, and so on, in their names and in their rhetoric, it did not necessarily mean that they had actually fully committed to representative democracy as an idea. What they had basically done was to say, look, Catholics need representation, so we need to be in parliament, we need to defend their interests, but it doesn't mean that we've accepted, let's say, modern political pluralism necessarily. However, what they also did, and that's also very visible already in the 19th century, is that they developed what for shorthand you might call a particular political technology. It's something that, I'll get back to this later, in certain ways is still visible today. By technology, I mean basically a certain approach to how one manages conflicts and disagreements, which of course are inevitable in a pluralistic democracy. And what they, from the get-go, suggested, very much inspired, as many of you will know, very much inspired by Leo XIII's thinking about wanting a harmonious society, unlike, Marxists and socialists who want a class conflict, supposedly. Basically, the task of such parties was to mediate conflict and to find ways of basically doing justice to all claims one could possibly find in a society. So in a sense, consciously pacifying, if you like, even harmonizing approach to politics, where in the end, ideally, all groups would, find that their legitimate interests were taken care of. Maybe sounds vaguely familiar in Austria. I don't know. You tell me. So that was, in a sense, peculiar about these parties. And what I'm suggesting to you, and here I'm opening the second chapter of my talk, in the 20th century, all three strategies become transformed, but they're still visible. They're still recognizable. So what about the people as Christian? Well, some of the most important actors in 20th century thinking about religion and democracy certainly recognize that the idea of a fully Christian demos, let alone the idea of a demos where everybody has the same confession, is unrealistic. As Jacques Maritain, probably the most influential figure in this context, put it, it's a misfortune that we have these religious divisions, but we simply have to live with them and come to terms with them. And it doesn't mean that we have to give up on the people. His specific suggestion was that one could rely on what he called, with a very intriguing formulation, prophetic shock minorities. It was enough if you had smaller groups who were very serious about their beliefs, and they would, as you also put it, they would act like a sort of ferment in society. They would shake other people up. They would remind other people of the right kind of moral and potentially also religious commitments. So a kind of second best, if you like, but something that is still very recognizable as the first strategy that I was trying to make plausible to you. What about the second one? Constraints on the people, maybe even supranational constraints on the people. Well, my candidate for an institution that was meant to do something like this in the 20th century is an institution that, maybe not for good reasons, is much in the news at the moment. It's the European Convention for Human Rights. I think it's largely forgotten that even though it's nowadays so often attacked as a supposedly left-wing progressive project, the European Convention for Human Rights was fashioned by continental Christian Democrats and British Tories. And at the time, it was perceived as, well, a more or less right-wing project aimed at, well, as I'm sure you all have guessed, at the East, at socialism, at social democracy even. So it was something that was deeply imbued with the thinking of more or less conservative and certainly Christian democratic actors. And it was meant to basically have the same function of providing a supranational constraint on the people. And I think it's not too controversial to say that it did prove, for all its shortcomings perhaps, it did prove to be the most successful regional human rights regime in the world. So that was strategy number 2 in the 20th century. What about the third one? Well, you all know the answer. After 1945, Christian democratic parties are wildly successful in Western Europe. They, in many countries, not all of course, but in many countries, they get to create a certain kind of welfare state, deeply imbued with certain values one might or might not like, patriarchy, certain expectations of what women are supposed to do, a very particular kind of welfare state, but nevertheless, that's what they end up accomplishing. And another thing that everybody in this room knows, they of course are the original architects of European integration. And maybe it's just belaboring the obvious to point out that they are the architects because they didn't have any principled investment in the nation state in the way that other political actors had. And why didn't they have this investment? Well, as hinted at earlier, especially in Germany and Italy, Catholics, of course, had experienced newly unified nation states as hostile, more or less secular, or at least Protestant actors who had attacked Catholics. So no wonder that, Adenauer, de Gasperi, etc., all the usual suspects, didn't feel that there was something morally important about preserving the national in and of itself. Before I move quickly on to the third chapter, which more or less gets us to the present, allow me one lengthy footnote. Because I worry that some of you are already thinking, ooh, this is not only chronological, this sounds awfully teleological. Everything is moving along nicely in this pattern. You can always sort of see the same things and so on. So allow me a footnote to kind of add a complication, or as in German we might say, ein bisschen Sand im Getriebe, damit es nicht ganz so schnell vorangeht. The story I want to tell in the footnote concerns a state that is often seen as Exhibit A for an archetypal Christian democratic creation after 1945. In fact, Martin Niemöller at one point said it was a state that was begotten in the Vatican and born in Washington. West Germany, of course. Looking back at it now, we think, okay, it was obvious. Adenauer in charge, CDU, at least on one occasion, with an absolute majority. What was there not to like for Catholics? Well, it turns out the answer is plenty of things in the areas of families and education. And many Catholics actually preserved a certain distance towards this new regime. And more specifically, they also were very resistant in principle to accept the idea of modern representative democracy. Along comes a young lawyer, Catholic, social democrat, and infamously for many people, somebody who didn't deny that he was a pupil of Carl Schmitt. I'm talking about Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde, who later on, as many of you are nodding, ends up on the German Constitutional Court, and, as some of you might also remember, author of what is often said to be the most quoted single sentence in post-war German political thought, namely that the liberal secularized state basically has to rely on or lives of presuppositions which it cannot itself guarantee. Every second speech by a German politician will feature this sentence. This is not an empirical prediction, but it feels about right in terms of how often you hear this. Now, the unfortunate thing is that de facto, it's very often misconstrued. Because those who quote this line usually want to suggest, okay, there's something deficient about democracy. And if you think back to the earlier point about democracy always posing a risk, it's not a crazy thought. And furthermore, those who quote along these lines also very often then want to say, it needs some kind of, democracy needs an injection of morality and, maybe even religion, because otherwise, basically, purely procedural democracy might go wrong. Pretty much the thought that I started out with, pretty much the thought that if you think back, a figure like Josef Ratzinger would very often still repeat, would basically say the real lesson of the 20th century is that democracy left to itself, left to its own procedures, can potentially become totalitarian. But that's not what Böckenförde was trying to say. He was actually, in the course of the 1950s, making an appeal to fellow Catholics and basically said, look, democracy is a risk, and you have to accept that risk. In theory, one could think of a completely homogeneous society, again, the completely homogeneous demos I was hinting at earlier. But like Maritain, he thought that was no longer really a possibility. And he certainly, of course, didn't want to go down the route of Franco and Salazar. So he basically told Catholics in the late 1950s, democracy is a structurally open form, which I think is a variation of this idea about uncertainty. And what we really are looking for is what he ended up calling a democratic ethos, where we basically treat each other in such a way that majorities will not tyrannize minorities, and that we basically remain invested in the idea of living together on free and fair terms. So he says it in the late 1950s in a very influential Catholic journal, and all hell breaks loose. Lots of pushback from the hierarchy, lots of pushback from other actors who think that, you know, who is this young man who thinks he can make these points? But Böckenförde, in a sense, has something up his sleeve when he has to basically respond to these critics. And what he has up his sleeve is what, for the time, is a groundbreaking historical investigation. And that historical investigation is eventually published also in that journal under the title, The Situation of German Catholicism in the Year 1933. Böckenförde is basically the first who revisits the conduct of Catholics in 33, and on the basis of a lot of archival findings basically says, look, you made a deal with the devil, to put it this way. You thought the Nazis were going to protect your core interests, inspired by natural law thinking, with the family, with education, and so on. And look where that got you. Now, that didn't convince everybody, but in a certain way, it was a very powerful argument. That in a sense, if you're serious about living with people who are different, you do have to accept the risk of democracy, and you have to accept what he was outlining as a democratic ethos. So the famous sentence is not really about always having to inject something else, although, of course, it can be read this way. It was more a way of saying, look, there are no guarantees. It's always going to be an open and risky form of politics, and you better come to terms with it. And then you can still do a lot of things. You can become engaged and active as a citizen in order to, make it as safe as possible, but you got to accept this basic characteristic of democracy. That was a pretty long footnote, but I hope it was a useful reminder of how that whole story is not as smooth as it's sometimes made out to be. So allow me to open the third and final chapter. Where are we today? Well, there are plenty of people who, with a German word, which I think is really difficult to translate into English, one is tempted to call Erbschleicher. In other words, people who want to appropriate a certain legacy, but when you look more closely, they are not really entitled to that legacy. And the first example, and this will, I think, again, not surprise anybody in this room, is a figure just a little bit further to the east of here. Of course, there have already now been many, many years during which Viktor Orban has gone around Europe and by now the world saying, I am the last authentic Christian Democrat. And all these other figures, starting with Angela Merkel, have basically sold out, have betrayed the legacy, and so on. But as many people before me have pointed out, what we really are dealing with here is a form of, for shorthand, Christian populism, or what is nowadays in the US context often called Christian nationalism, even though it sometimes comes with a somewhat more attractive label, national conservatism. It's basically about political actors saying, look, I and only I represent the people, our nation. To make that plausible, of course, I, the supposedly uniquely correct representative of the people, have to explain what characterizes the people, and this is where religion comes in very handy. As Olivier Roy has put it with a perfect, succinct formulation, this is all about belonging. It's not about believing. It's also, by the way, not about behavior. It's not whether you actually behave as a Christian in your daily life. It is simply about declaring your belonging to a particular body. And some of the relevant actors really give the game away. So Giorgia Meloni, in her quasi-autobiography, Io Giorgia, writes, more or less quoting from memory, the Christian identity can be secular rather than religious. Okay, I think that gives the game away about as clearly as one possibly can. Now, I say Abschleicher, or suggest a certain illegitimacy, because all these actors simply betray the earlier legacy of conceiving of Christian democracy as something that was not necessarily completely anti-national. I mean, some of you may immediately say, look, if you read John Paul II, he was not, per se anti-national. True. But there was certainly something strongly anti-nationalist. And there certainly would not have been this concession along the lines, as long as you tell us that you properly belong, everything else doesn't matter. You can behave in whatever way you like. That is clearly a betrayal of this authentic tradition. The second strand of thinking that has become more prominent in recent years, much more so, however, in the US than here, but seems like this is one of the rare occasions when the cliche that what happens in the US sooner or later also happens in Europe might actually be valid, is something that is nowadays often subsumed under the label post-liberalism. Now, this is a complicated story in terms of where that term comes from, who the actors are, and one shouldn't too glibly sort of generalize about what some of these people want. If anybody's interested, I'm happy to give a 3-hour lecture later on about how that term is evolving and how it travels back and forth across the Atlantic. But forgive me that for shorthand, I simply say the following. I simply say that some of the most prominent representatives of this strand of thought are very comfortable with the idea that the state ultimately does serve the purpose of imposing the correct morality on people. Whereas liberals, of course, are deluded to think that the state should be as neutral as possible, should not, impose a particular understanding of morality or the good life, and so on. And what this has meant in practice for some of these thinkers is also that they're very, very comfortable with an enormous concentration of power in the executive. And essentially what you all know is happening in the US today, in certain ways reflects some of the intuitions that these people have. That if you have a state, you may as well use it to do what you think is the right thing. And if you happen to know what the right thing is, because, you've understood natural law, then this is the way to go. And once more, of course, for many of those who think along these lines, there is a country in Europe which has already shown how wonderful the outcomes of this approach can be. It is, the kind of far-right Disneyland that is your next-door neighbor, namely Hungary, where Viktor Orban is often lauded by these people as, look, he's the one who actually dared to govern in the sense of using the state to implement the right kind of morality. Now, I say that this is also a betrayal because while, of course, Christian Democrats lived with states and used states, they weren't anarchists, they nevertheless, if you recall from earlier on, had this particular approach to governing, which was not about concentrating power as much as possible, but which was trying to basically mediate between different interests, find some kind of balance, Ausgleich of one form or another. And even more important, these were thinkers who were very invested in ideas about pluralism, decentralization, and, as again, everybody in this room will already know, subsidiarity. And it's astonishing if today, for instance, you read a thinker like Adrian Vermeule, the famous Harvard jurist, who's very invested in this line of post-liberal thinking. So he mentions subsidiarity. He even mentions an Austrian thinker called Johannes Messner, who some of you will be very familiar with. And then he basically immediately takes it back and says, yeah, subsidiarity is good. But if there's a real problem, the state should really sort of jump in anyway and do whatever is right. So it's sort of offered as a gesture and then literally immediately taken back. And that's very different from these earlier Christian Democrats who really did have a view of society as differentiated, as heterogeneous, as pluralistic, and ideally as decentralized, because that also made it more plausible that you were going to somehow be able to mediate between different kinds of interests, including, of course, especially local interests. So this is why, harshly, but maybe not unjustly, I want to convince you that these two strands of thought, even though they constantly talk about Catholicism, even though they sometimes explicitly claim Christian democracy, are actually pretenders. They are indeed Erbschleicher. All right, you might, however, also now wonder, okay, but what about these three strategies? What happened to them, given where we are now in the world? Well, I think it's hard to argue that they work particularly well today. Think back to the first one, the people themselves. It's almost banal to mention the fact that, well, with, secularization, it's becoming ever less plausible to make the argument that the people themselves will be the repository of certain core, let's say, Christian or even more specifically Catholic intuitions. What about supranational constraints? Well, just this week, as you will know, 9 nation-states are getting together and are saying Strasbourg is too powerful. We need to basically find a different settlement as far as this otherwise very, very successful regional human rights regime is concerned. It would have been unthinkable, I think, 10 or 20 years ago, and plenty of jurists are already pushing back and saying, look, this is absolutely the wrong way to go. These universal human rights are not up for negotiation. And yes, we can talk about all kinds of practical ways to deal better with refugees and migrants and so on, but this is the wrong way of going about it. But I think it's not an accident that states which, are not usually in the category of, oh, these are the bad guys in Europe, are nevertheless willing to go this way, because the general belief in and energy behind supranational institutions has declined so precipitously over the last couple of decades. And that in turn has something to do with what has happened to the third strategy, which you remember came down to actual Christian democratic parties. I think it's not unkind to say that many of them have been very defeatist as far as their earlier commitments were concerned. It's very hard to think of any major Christian democratic politician who nowadays would truly risk something politically for the sake of certain ideals to do with European integration. But as all of you know, there were times when people actually did this kind of thing. But these times are long past us. Maybe less obviously, it might also be correct that in a sense they face a structural challenge as far as this political technology of mediating among different interests is concerned. Because in a society which many of our colleagues in the social sciences would say is becoming, in a sense, more fragmented, more individualized, disaggregated in certain ways, and at the same time, more polarized, it's more difficult to find these focal points for mediating among different interests, ideas, and maybe even identities. It was obviously easier in, what you might call the golden age of corporatism, where you could say, look, society is very organized. I know exactly who again, I don't feel I need to lecture you about this in Austria, but anyway, you know exactly who you have to talk to, and then, you find ways of, getting people to negotiate with each other, and you find something that looks indeed like a more or less harmonious outcome that everybody can live with. Something has happened to society which maybe makes that promise just more difficult to realize. So it's not just, bad intentions or forgetfulness or giving up on ideals that one should blame Christian Democrats for. They might indeed also face a somewhat difficult, genuine structural challenge. So as if all that weren't bad enough or depressing enough, maybe from your point of view, let me add the epilogue, which I also said was not exactly going to be very uplifting. As again, everybody knows, what we're doing right now happens at a pretty much unprecedented moment. Europe is being challenged from two sides simultaneously. It is threatened from two sides simultaneously, and is threatened by actors who, in a certain sense, are claiming Christianity for themselves. Obviously true of Russia and Orthodoxy, obviously now also true of those strands in the US, which can indeed be summed up with the label Christian nationalism. You will have seen the document that was published last week, which basically tells us that Europe faces civilizational erasure. Part of that claim is that Europe is losing its Christian heritage, supposedly, and maybe nice Americans will help us, to somehow hold on to it. What this means in practice, though, is that it might be time to think about what you might call a post-West Europe, because the West, as we knew it, clearly doesn't exist anymore. And when you say post-West Europe, what might also come to mind? Of course, the expression post-Europe from Jan Patočka. And what might be interesting to feed into our conversation is one of his ideas from the Heretical Essays, where he basically gestures at the possibility of a Christianity after Christendom in Europe, which sounds a little bit like a Christianity that has left behind these identitarian myths and is concentrating on something else. It's an idea, by the way, for those of you who are interested in this, that also was once articulated by Charles Taylor in one of his lesser known writings, when he said, for the true moral intuitions of Christianity to come out, it required what he called a breach with Christian culture. And Ludger will correct me, but I think maybe Patočka was hinting at something somewhat similar. Now, you might say there's also a great irony, given where we are in our historical constellation, that all this is happening with the post-West Europe at precisely the moment when we have an American Pope in the middle of Europe. And we have an American Pope who, I think it's fair to say at this point, is precisely disavowing nationalism, is precisely positioning himself against anything that could look like Christian nationalism. If I have time for one tiny footnote, don't worry, it will not be 3 hours. It already came out very clearly in an episode that some of you may remember from earlier this year. It's when the American vice president had basically attacked a British politician, Rory Stewart, by saying that, look, of course, the nation comes first, and the rest of humanity comes later. Your family, of course, is the first instance of who you turn to and morally care about, but then there's sort of this series of concentric circles. And then in inimitable fashion, only I think somebody of that generation could put it like this, he simply told the British politician, Google Ordo Amoris Augustine, okay? And if you do that, yes, you might think there's something there. And there was a bit of back and forth between these two politicians, but then a voice which one likes to think is not entirely irrelevant for Catholics also entered this debate, because one of the last things that Francis did, you may recall in February, was to write a letter to the American bishops. And some people think it was basically already written by the person who is Pope now. And of course he didn't name names, but the rejection of the thought could not have been clearer. So it's an interesting question, what Europe will do with this particular constellation, whether it sees this as somehow an opportunity to claim maybe certain Christian intuitions and legacies, distance itself clearly from these nefarious forms of Christian nationalism and populism, and see where that goes. Obviously, like all such high-minded appeals, there's always a danger of, essentialism. Many of us in this room are old enough to have lived through various manifestos where various intellectuals said, now is the moment where Europe will finally come into its own and show its true moral core and so on. More than once in the last couple of decades, somebody felt compelled to declare that this was the hour of Europe. And the hour of Europe has very often passed without anything happening. But I think this is a moment where, so to speak, minds have to be concentrated, because the challenge is just so in your face, so unprecedented. And I think it does force us to think more broadly about what this post-West Europe might be about. But it might also be a good moment to rethink and perhaps reappropriate some of the legacies that I was trying to talk about to you tonight. Thank you for your attention.
Jan-Werner, thank you very much for that. And also, is my mic on? It is, I think. And in particular, what an excellent presentation. I mean, your style. It was. I really.
You really want to say American, right? But you know.
So I've got a couple of questions. So I was trying to use your three origin stories of the 19th century as well, and look at the post-Second World War world and Europe, where there were two overwhelmingly influential Christian democratic parties. One was in Germany and one was in Italy. And these were very different phenomena. And I felt that you were talking to the German experience a lot of the time. The techniques and mechanisms of the Christian Democrats in Italy were very different and often very nasty in a way that they weren't in Germany. And it's possibly not a coincidence that after 1989, the Christian Democrats in Germany not only move forward, but they, to a degree, assimilate part of the population in the eastern half of Germany. Christian Democrats in Italy are finally exposed for what they are, which is, not much more than a mafia organization in cahoots with the Catholic Church and the real mafia itself. So my question there is, do your origin stories apply to Germany specifically, or does it apply to other parts of Europe as well? That's my first question. I'll come back to the second question, which is on a slightly different issue.
So very clear answer, yes and no. So you're absolutely right to pinpoint that this was a somewhat provincial rendering of that story, but I think it's not an entirely provincial one. It's true, of course, as you politely pointed out, that there was a reason why Christian Democrats were literally always in power in Italy. Some of the nasty stuff, but I think one could also add, sheer clientelism as another kind of governing technique. There's a reason why they always had to hold on to the post office, because that was particularly good for giving out certain kinds of jobs to local clientele. So yeah, it was a governing machine. No question about it. But I think some of the animating figures, and including some of the real politicians, were different. So if you think back to someone like Luigi Sturzo or even De Gasperi or some of the people who ended up writing the Italian constitution, which is a very social constitution, which has a lot of communitarian language, you do find similar ideas. The fact that then the realization was different, I think is obviously not a totally unconnected story. But I think we should not entirely discount some of the ideals that were behind it. One other thing that I think that is maybe worth reminding ourselves of, although again, probably pretty obvious, is that there's only one thing that is worse than having a mortal enemy. It is losing a mortal enemy. So obviously, Christian democracy post-45 was largely kept together by anti-communism. It was very important for these thinkers also to tell a story that they were both anti-communist and in a certain way anti-liberal at the same time, because they said, well, they're both forms of materialism. They both do not do justice to the spiritual dimension of human life. Otherwise, obviously, many differences between communism and liberalism. But it kind of, in a perverse way, actually sets up contemporary post-liberal figures like Legutko in Poland, who end up saying, actually, liberalism and communism are the same thing. And everything that happened to us after '89 in Poland is a horror story, which is at least as bad as communism in certain ways. So it's a complicated story in terms of what these people were thinking. But I think you do find similar ideas also in, let's say, the Benelux countries. You find it with the MRP in France, which then is sort of erased by the rise of Gaullism in the late 50s. But at least initially, in terms of what they were trying to set up by way of particular forms of the welfare state, by what they were trying to do supranationally, I think you do see a sort of common pattern. So yes, it's true that the answer to the question, how German is it, is usually zu Deutsch, no matter what. But I think it's not an entirely German one.
Thanks very much. And then the second question relates to what you were concluding at the end about post-West Europe. And the reason why it really struck me is I had a conversation early this morning with somebody who is deeply involved with what one might call the deep state somewhere here in Europe. And I asked them about the national security strategy and how they were reacting to this. And they said, this has sent a shock through Europe and the United Kingdom, the like of which they had never experienced before, because this was really the sign that the West as such is over, and that the West is now divided into two units, and that Europe is unable to imagine and cope with a hostile United States. And what they were arguing is that there is very little political capacity and imagination in Europe to manage this scenario. So on the one, I mean, he was essentially agreeing with what you were saying. I think so. There's a theoretical recognition that this is a break, but there's also a sense of despair because that the hour of Europe is come. They fear that the lack of action that we saw, for example, at the beginning of the Yugoslav wars, when we first heard that the hour of Europe is come, the lack of action will be repeated here. And actually, that sort of civilizational collapse, which Trump and Vance are predicting, may actually come to pass. Do you think that's a possibility? Maybe not the civilizational collapse, but clearly the collapse of Europe as a significant player.
So I don't do predictions, especially not about the future, but I would respond by saying that, look, I mean, the problem has not been unknown since about 2017. And to coin a phrase, Europe slept for many, many years. And yeah, there was the occasional hint that, yeah, maybe something changed. Maybe we cannot, live with a kind of structural dependency where a couple of 10,000 people in Wisconsin, go this way or that way, and the fate of everything hinges on that. But very little seems to have followed from that. So against that background, yes, it's now much more explicit. And when you think about it, it's extraordinary that basically what this document says is we are committed to regime change, but only in Western Europe. Everything else we'll deal with, everybody else via the, question of profit and business deals and so on. Only in Western Europe are we basically committed to helping actors who are in the business of overthrowing, not just particular governments or parties, but a certain way of doing politics. So in essence, I would agree. I think it's not alarmism, and whether Europe can come together or not will be, again, partly a structural question, partly a question of political judgment, which I now know sounds very banal. It always is, but to just illustrate the point with one thing that I found very troubling this year. When you think about a figure who inevitably will have to do a lot in this regard, Friedrich Merz, some of us at least were naive enough to think, okay, there's something very peculiar about him. No disrespect. He's very old. He's very clearly a child of the old West Germany that I was also talking about tonight. And in theory, that has an upside, because after Wolfgang Schäuble, there were very few German elites who had a kind of sensibility along the lines of whatever happens, whatever we do, you call Paris first, even if they don't matter. You make them feel like they do matter, you kind of keep them in the boat, and so on. As you all know, that disappeared at a certain point. But one could have thought, well, Merz still might have it, because he was so Western-oriented in a certain way. He was also very invested in, the Atlantic relationship, but he also, in a sense, would have had with France. And my, again, naive hope was, look, when he comes into power, he will not get involved in all these intra-German debates about migration and what happens at the border and so on. I mean, to be cynical about it, he leaves this to his interior minister, who probably enjoys playing the tough guy. And he says, look, I'm a European statesman. I need to reach out to Macron. Macron called in 2017, and nobody on the other end ever picked up the phone in Berlin. So this is the moment for me to kind of do something in the hour of need. And it would have been a perfectly plausible thing to say, especially now with what happened last week. This is not esoteric kind of, politics. It would have been very plausible to people to say that, look, I got to make this a priority. This is why foreign policy is now of overriding importance, and I know how to do it, and I'm going to do it with France, no matter how weak Macron might be, and so on. But we're not seeing that. But I think it would not have been rocket science, as we say in the US, to figure out that this was actually a certain kind of opportunity. And if people keep failing to see that, then yes, it's bleak. It's bleak.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me throw it open to the audience now. I don't have my proper glasses on today, so if I don't recognize you in person, please forgive me. It's because I can't see you. But one and then two. I'll take two questions, if I may.
Yeah. Apart from the political solution, we have seen again that Europe is endangered. Yeah. Apart from political solutions, you need a philosophical basis. Huh? And your idea of Christianity after Christianity was a little bit vague for me. So could you give a little bit more precision how this idea can save Europe and also give an idea to other entities? Thank you.
And I'll take one from Clemena as well, who I can see because she's very close to me.
Hi, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. Now, I don't know if this is of interest to you in any way, but I work on Russian philosophers, and some of them are Russian emigre philosophers. Some of these people were working very closely with some of the names you're mentioning. For example, Nikolai Berdyaev was a personal friend of Maritain. So all these people were sort of part of this group of thinkers after the 1920s, you know. And I think that the way I see it, and I wonder whether you agree with that, in a way, the whole idea of an awareness of the danger of a very strong totalitarian state is an idea that circulates in this circle partly through these people that are the embodiment of what a very strong state can do. And I think that this is in a way one tradition of Orthodox modern Christianity that you see. And it is interesting to think about it in those terms. A lot of these people were on the verge of being excommunicated by the Russian church. And so what you see now in Russia, the position of the patriarch on the war in Ukraine, on many other issues, gay rights and so on, is a completely different religious tradition. And it is interesting to see how the church nowadays in Russia never mentions all of these big names that were part of these religious discussions at the time, the group around Maritain and Berdyaev and so on. Now, this may be a very niche topic, but I just wonder whether you've come across something and if you find anything interesting about it. This is one thing. And can I also make a remark? I don't know anything about politics, but, you know, I think that the idea that there'll be regime change in governments where the approval ratings of the government are so low. I mean, Macron has 11% according to Politico. So nobody needs to overturn the government in France. It looks like they'll lose the elections. So I think this is a much greater, concern, I imagine, than worrying that there'll be regime change coming from America. Yeah, that's it.
Three questions.
So on the first one, I'm glad I have 3 hours left to engage with this very simple request. Look, I mean, I don't have a worked out system to, put on the table right here. I'm not a consultant to any of these parties, I should say. So I don't see it as my task to say, here's a new Christian democratic program for anybody. I would simply underline that I think you can do two things at the same time. You can essentially follow both this and the previous Pope and say, look, if you happen to be Christian, you should maybe pay some attention to who's trying to give you what ultimately should be a collectively binding understanding of your faith. And that might help you to shake you out of assumptions which are very easy to hold because, again, as everybody in this room knows, for the last 20 or 30 years or so, we've seen a trend which can only be summed up as the mainstreaming of the far right. So plenty of people who should have held the line in terms of very basic moral commitments eventually gave up on them, felt that they had to adapt to something which, they maybe sometimes saw as inevitable as a trend, but which certainly wasn't inevitable. So I think that's one thing. And then on the other hand, you could also, for non-Christians, say, look, here are certain moral intuitions about what we've experienced on this continent and what lessons one may have drawn, lessons that certainly our grandparents and great-grandparents still were able to draw. This is where Patočka could come into the picture. So there's something to work with. Is all I'm saying. And the question is whether somebody will take up the challenge. But it does have, and this gets me to, I guess, your third question. The third question, it does have something to do with, I think, what is still underestimated as the sort of comprehensive willingness, to put it bluntly, of center-right actors in Europe today to basically throw in the towel as far as the far right is concerned. Everybody is very familiar with this ubiquitous metaphor/image, the populist wave, or as Nigel Farage, for whom apparently the wave was too puny a metaphor given his own role, the tsunami of populism, according to Nigel Farage. Everybody's familiar with this diagnosis, and we're told about it day and night. I would simply, for your consideration, mention a somewhat different view that comes from a former colleague at Princeton called Larry Bartels, who wrote what I think was a very important book, which unfortunately didn't get a lot of resonance in Europe. The book has the title Democracy Erodes from the Top. And what Bartels shows is that contrary to what seems to have become complete conventional wisdom, which is that, after the financial crisis, people become disillusioned and turn to protest parties or populist parties. After 2015, people have totally different views about refugees and migrants and so on. If you look carefully at surveys, it simply happens not to be true. In which case you will say, okay, but I look at election results. Something is happening. You can't tell me that nothing is happening. But what Bartels shows us is that, something is happening, but the mechanisms or dynamics are different from this idea of a wave, which does imply a certain inevitability. I mean, none of us can stop a wave, let alone a tsunami. And what he shows is that, what's really happening is that, at least in some countries, citizens who always had right-wing extremist attitudes all of a sudden have a party. It's basically the German case they can vote for. And center-right actors have been legitimating these positions over many, many years. To just use, since you talked about France, for me, one of the most striking examples remains Valérie Pécresse in 2022 presidential campaign. Gaullist, as mainstream as it can possibly get in the Fifth Republic. It is their republic in a certain way. And you may recall that she gave a speech where she basically said, it's maybe true that somebody is sending Muslims here to replace Christian Europeans. And then she tried to take it back the next day because, of course, it did trigger a scandal. But once you've told your nice bourgeois voters who think of themselves as centrist and reasonable and everything, that, what Le Pen, etc., has been saying all along, of course you say, look, why would I not vote for the original? So I think this is not a philosophical answer. I realize that, but in a certain way, we have to sort of think everything together with the actual political dynamics that we are seeing, and that also maybe is a bit of an answer to the third question about, okay, yes, it looks very bleak for certain actors, but that's the outcome, again, of sometimes, I think, catastrophic misjudgments in terms of how they have positioned themselves. And on the second one, it's extremely interesting. And I think we sometimes forget how these conversations among European intellectuals actually happened transnationally. And I think it would be salutary to be reminded of them, because it would counter the tendency, which you also, of course, see today, by, again, to put it very bluntly, illiberal or sometimes outright anti-democratic actors to tell us a story about religion. So the way that sometimes in the US now, people basically say, look, orthodoxy is the last real thing. That's the last real form of Christianity. So there's a whole actually set of examples of people who, keep converting. And this is always the last thing they want to convert to. This is finally, the real thing for them. And it would be helpful if one could say, look, there are other thinkers, and the examples you mentioned are very serious people. So here's a very different understanding that should be recognizable to anybody who is actually in that world as entirely legitimate. And it had a certain effect. And we're not helping ourselves, we're not doing ourselves a favor if we forget these figures. And if we also, without sort of descending into some facile sort of ecumenical line on this. Nevertheless, in the 20s and 30s, arguably there was more of a transnational conversation about some of these issues than we have today, even though we like to congratulate ourselves that, we live in such a globalized, supposedly borderless world. So the short answer is yes.
Just to back up what you said about the French example with the example from the United Kingdom, in 2015 when the election was held, which Cameron won to his surprise with an overall majority, the issue of Europe was number 11 on polls that were taken during that election campaign. By June 2016, when the referendum was held, it was issue number 3 for the importance of people in polls. That was generated over the space of 14 months through the mechanisms that you identified and the characters you identified. I've got 2 questions, one there and one here, and we haven't finished, so don't worry, I will come to other people as well.
I would have thought that...
It would be great if you could introduce yourself.
Felix Meyerhofer. I would have thought that typically, or the most important for Christian parties or Christian polities is the protection of life. So that means being against abortion, being against euthanasia, and so forth. Being for the family. Now, if that I wanted to know whether this concept is right and whether under this definition there ever were Christian parties and whether there are any today.
That's one question, and the second one just here.
Yeah, thanks, Rainer Bauberg. Thanks very much. My question builds on your answer to the previous question about the contemporary dilemma that Christian Democrats seem to be facing. And as you have explained in some of your other writings, that although Christian Democrats are losing in election after election, they have got into the pivotal position in the center of the political spectrum, where it really depends on them whether the populist tsunami materializes in a way that the populists can grab power. And that includes, obviously, this country and in the future, maybe also Germany. Now, the question is, how can your framework of explaining the driving question of Christian democracy, how can democracy be made safe for religion, still help us to understand how contemporary Christian Democratic Party leaders grapple with their contemporary dilemma, with whom to form coalitions in order to save democracy or abandon democracy? And I'm just slightly skeptical that it's still the same question. Just looking at the speeches and the minds of these Christian democratic leaders, it seems to me that making democracy safe for religion seems to have become a kind of secondary concern. And maybe, that would be the hopeful interpretation. They have come to realize that they do share a set of values with social democrats and liberals that are worth defending. Or maybe they are just in the power game. And I think they will be losing out if they form coalitions with the far right. And therefore, for the sake of self-preservation, they'd better stick to the Brandmauer with the social democrats and the liberals. So how can, the value basis of Christian democracy still help us to understand their contemporary political dilemma?
Off you go.
Both very good, which is to say difficult questions. So On the first one, I would slightly take issue with the idea that for all parties that go anywhere near Christianity, abortion has to be the number one topic. In the United States, it looks like this since the 1970s, but it wasn't always like this. I mean, this is, again, the primacy of the political, if you like. There are certain political entrepreneurs who basically made this central for a certain constituency, but it was not always the thing that everybody who vaguely thought of themselves as religious would have said that's the most important thing to achieve in politics. Secondly, you might say, well, in a particular way, everybody has become a small L liberal at a certain point, by which I mean accepting the idea that you might have a very strong view inspired by religion, but you cannot, in a pluralistic, heterogeneous society, expect to impose it on everybody. You can make the claim for it and say, look, I want to remind people about this intuition that matters to me, that this position is out there, and I want to give the best possible arguments, but I cannot do the thing that some of the post-liberals I was describing think they can do, which is to say, we're simply going to impose it because we happen to know that it is right. Now, you can read that story in multiple ways. Of course, for the post-liberals, that's backup for their claim about how nefarious liberalism is and how it basically has won everywhere and infiltrated everything, and that's why it is so important to push it back. Question is, what is the price for pushing it back? So I know that's not really entirely answering your question, but I hope it was interesting anyway. And on Rainer's question, so trying to trace these strategies was not, in a sense, meant to be prescriptive, as in, okay, this is sort of how we now could learn something about what we have to do today. I would go along with what I take to be a sort of implied suggestion there, which is that actually, if anything, one should remember the components of Christian democracy that in the broader sense were communitarian, solidaristic, that basically always made Christian Democrats also say, we're not liberals in the European sense, certainly not neoliberals, we're also not conservatives, we have very peculiar ideas, and in certain ways, even though our justifications are different. I mean, again, this goes back to the story that supposedly socialists and Marxists were all purely materialistic, nevertheless allowed us to cooperate on certain points. So I think that is a plausible strategy. Strategy is maybe too big a word, but it's a plausible sort of set of resources, if you like, that one could work with in terms of saying, look, we're not doing what now the far right and some within the center right are always saying, which is, look, we're only ever going to get a left-wing government. People really want something different. And this is so unfair that, we have clear, German cases, again, sorry for being so provincial once more. It's the most obvious case right now, where you very often nowadays hear, but look, the people want a right-wing government. And again, they get one of these horrible grand coalitions. Now, just for the record, of course, this kind of mechanistic adding up of percentages is completely wrong-headed. If the CDU actually said we are going to have a coalition with the far right, plenty of people would say, "Oh, we're not going to vote for them." The usual story that, "Oh, but we came in first and hence we are entitled to govern," maybe sounds familiar in Austria, is also flawed from a, dare I say, democratic theory point of view. Yes, if you win 50% plus one, sure, you're entitled to govern, but everything else is up for negotiation, and it's not up to you what you decide. And maybe less obvious for a change, it's completely forgotten today, I think, that 2013, Merkel's greatest triumph, 40%, but it was actually, according to this mechanistic way of thinking, the people wanted a left-wing government. She only got 40%. 60% wanted something else. And if I recall, the only prominent voice who at that time said, okay, it's time for the SPD to be done with its Brandmauer, was Bernhard Schlink, who said, actually, forget Merkel. This is the time to at last have a truly reformist German government. Well, you all know what happened, or rather didn't happen. But at the time, what nowadays is so automatically sort of accepted by many people, that this adding up of numbers generates some kind of legitimacy, I think at the time was basically unheard of, and nobody went along with this very simplistic way of thinking.
Thanks. Now, oddly, I can't recognize Jim O'Brien, but I do recognize his glasses. So,
leaning around the camera. Hi, I'm Jim O'Brien. I'm a fellow here because As you can hear from my accent, I'm no longer suitable to work in the US government. I have a question about the politics around the national security strategy. The hostility it expresses is deeply held, but by a tiny minority in America. And it's a minority that lived as a kind of counterpoint from the 19th century to the three mechanisms you identified. It's useful today to the Trump administration, but I wonder if you could reflect maybe on historical parallels where this hostility sort of rose up and fell down, and in particular, because the new Pope, and you alluded to this, 2 weeks ago sent out all the bishops to instruct American Catholics that they should be considering which leaders respect the dignity and are kind toward other people. It's the first time since the early 70s that Catholics have been told they should vote on anything other than abortion. And I wonder if that portends a sort of rapid turn from this and maybe a little less dramatic reading of the effects of the national security strategy.
Thank you, Jim. And Lutger, you have a question.
Thank you, Jan. Saying thank you, Jan, it already indicates that you have a natural authority to speak about the name giver of this lecture, because you share the first name. I think the first time this has happened. No, you were addressing me in the talk, and you were speaking about the philosophy of the name giver of this lecture. And Patočka is one of those people who really, before the post became so famous, before the times of post-histoire and so on, was speaking a lot about this philosophy of the post-Christian. You mentioned Christianity after Christianity, and this is maybe some answer to Mr. Spanocki, the first question: what is this Christianity after Christianity? It's a philosophical religion in some sense. It's care for the soul. You can call it Platonism, but the idea would be maybe Platonism itself is not strong enough. You need religion to have this care for the soul thing. And you had this very nice formulation of the shaking out. This is very much along that lines. But the other thing, and that I found really breathtaking in what you said, is that Patočka in the 1970s is writing about the inheritors of Europe. And those two at that time are the Soviet Union and the US, right? And the question whether they are the true inheritors or the, as you said, Erbschleicher, this is somewhat left open, but I think there is some tendency to understand them as Erbschleicher, both of them. But the eerie development is that this is back now. After 1989, this was totally outdated to even think that way, but that it is so urgently back now, and that there is, as you put it, this pressure from both sides. This, I think, is really a very interesting aspect of this post-European thinking.
On the first question, which is extremely interesting, maybe also extremely complicated. So if I may, I'll try to say three things in response. One is that I think it's been clear for a while now that there seems to be this curious split between sort of hard-right Catholic elite actors, including on certain courts, as everybody knows, and a laity that is actually quite different. So just as a data point, when Rick Santorum ran for president in 2012, he kind of played up the Catholicism quite significantly. But Catholics didn't vote for him. It was the evangelicals who liked what he was selling. So in that sense, there's also now this sort of strange sort of constellation where you feel, yes, you can think of very prominent hard-right Catholics who are pushing regime change, basically, and who find a certain resonance, but it's not like there's anything underneath in terms of, okay, that actually has a social stratum, or you could sort of, go to a place and sort of fall into conversation with people about this. And the Christian nationalism, really relates to quite different denominations, and sometimes, especially if you think about charismatics, is so disorganized, actually, that it's not even clear, who's sort of representative, who you could find as a spokesperson, and so on. But that doesn't make it any less dangerous. But in a perverse way, it would be easier if one could simply say, look, I got to talk to people in a hierarchy, and then I sort of can know how I might sort of advance certain arguments. That's number one. Number two is that it might be worth reflecting on how our moment relates to a previous, if you like, anti-European moment that is still going to be alive in people's memories. So basically what happened around 2002, 2003. Remember all these, sort of pamphlets, books about Mars, Venus, how Europeans were these cowards and so on. But also how back then already there was this very strong impetus that, people really didn't like the European Union. And it's worth reflecting on why that is, whether it's simply basically a deep-seated nationalism. Very often these arguments were dressed up in the language of democracy. So figures like Jed Rubenfeld at Yale and others would say, look, supranational governance is bad because, basically democracy only works with a people, a nation, and so on. So the Europeans don't really believe in democracy anymore. These sorts of arguments were already around at that moment. And then last point, of course, it's not news that something that I think was rightly discounted for quite a while, namely the sort of specter of an international of nationalists, which we've been reading about, for decades now, but where very often you felt, look, it's not true that this is sort of deeply contradictory. You can have an international of nationalists. There was a liberal international of nationalists in the 19th century, Mazzini and figures like this. It's not a contradiction necessarily, but it didn't seem to mean very much in terms of actual sacrifices. It's not like Orban said, okay, I will never meet Joe Biden because he's not actually the president, right? But now I think the game has changed. And the game has changed in situations where behind this kind of transnational, call it what you wish, nationalist, populist, far-right solidarity, real American material interests are present. So when you think back to what they did with Brazil, it was already the fact that they didn't like how Brazil was regulating Musk's platform. Same story now about the EU, of course. All this talk about Europeans have no free speech and so on. There's a real interest behind this, and it's I'll throw this out as speculation. Maybe somebody has a view on this. It's an interesting question. What exactly is the material interest, if this interpretation is not completely wrong, behind giving Orban the exemption in terms of oil, maybe also gas? I think it's actually disputed what exactly was agreed. Some people say, well, it's because Westinghouse wants to get in on the act with the nuclear power plant, Patočka. Maybe there's something else. Maybe that's too cynical. I don't know. But it seems like, okay, there's something going on now that is much more robust than what we had even, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago. And ultimately, that might give this kind of anti-Europeanism a thrust and a force that it didn't have in previous iterations.
Ludger wasn't
I'll just
really
accept
a
that,
question, but if you want to comment on it, you can. But that response to Jim's question was absolutely fascinating and on point, I think. Do we have any more questions? I see there behind the camera, so I have absolutely no idea who you are.
Thank you so much. My name is Miguel de la Riva. I'm a freelance journalist, philosopher at University of Vienna. My first question is, I'm not so knowledgeable about North America, but if I'm not mistaken, Catholicism was viewed fairly skeptical within the United States Christian nationalism. And now it seems people are particularly eager to deliberately convert to Catholicism. So could you perhaps tell me something about why people like J.D. Vance like Catholicism as opposed to other kinds of Christianity so much? And the second question is, if the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Union, as I think you rightly reminded us of, is largely the inheritance of Christian democracy, why are Christian democratic parties today, why do they seem so willingly to give that heritage up? So not only is the heritage being erschlichen, but also being kind of deliberately, voluntarily given up. Is that just a kind of short-termist strategic move vis-a-vis competition from the far right, or is there a more substantive estrangement from their own creations going on here? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe it's just worth reminding ourselves how deeply anti-Catholic sentiments in the US ran for a very long time. I mean, if you think back to the 19th century, the Know Nothing Party, these were all primarily anti-Catholic political enterprises. People in this room will remember the story about JFK. Is he actually going to be an American president, or is he going to get instructions from Rome? And maybe less obviously, what people nowadays sometimes say about Islam, which is, okay, there is some fundamental incompatibility between that religion and democracy, of course was said about Catholicism for a very long time. You could find very credible social scientists in the 1950s saying, look, it's not an accident that democracy is failing in Latin America all the time, because that's because of the Catholic background conditions. And plenty of American observers, when Christian democratic parties were coming into power in Italy and Germany, they were actually extremely worried. They thought, okay, they're going to, get in, and then they will abandon the democratic part. I mean, this was a real worry, and these were not conspiracy theorists. These were not marginal people. These are figures like H. Stuart Hughes, for instance, the distinguished intellectual historian at Harvard, who kept saying, look, they only care about the Christian part. They don't care about the democracy part. And we basically the same worry that you sometimes nowadays have with, parties which one may or may not subsume under the label Muslim democracy. Once they get in, they will abandon the democratic pretense and so on. There was a very live concern and set of discussions in the 50s and 60s still, and has more or less disappeared since. Now, I don't live inside the mind of the vice president, and if you don't mind, I will not try to get inside his mind. I think he left behind some evidence, some book or something that might give you some clue. But I think the phenomenon of, especially also young people, saying, okay, this is maybe intellectually the most coherent thing that's on offer, that I would not underestimate. And this, I think, partly explains the resonance of an otherwise very idiosyncratic figure like Jan-Werner Müller at Harvard. It's not like, plenty of other people are sort of saying the same thing. And yet he's been able to mobilize a surprisingly large number of, jurists and younger people who are kind of willing to say, yeah, that sort of has a certain attraction. I don't want to speculate whether the attraction is partly the clearly authoritarian element in it. But if nothing else, and that I've seen personally, you sometimes do have interesting conversations with, forgive the somewhat patronizing expression, young people who just feel that this is where the action is. Or if nothing else, certain frisson. If I really want to shock my parents, maybe this is the way to go. And one of the more serious and less psychological ways of putting it is to say, okay, is Müller maybe right in certain ways when he says, of course, the US is not, converting to Catholicism, but our public structures are becoming more Catholic in certain ways. I don't think this is necessarily right, but it's not a crazy thing to want to think about. If you think about some of the actual policies that have been, for all the incompetence and cruelty and everything else, nevertheless, some of the stuff that has been happening, you might say, okay, is this a revival of a certain kind of corporatism? Maybe. When the state all of a sudden says, we're going to acquire a stake in your industry and we're going to start steering certain other sectors of the economy. That's a big break with, of course, what Republicans would have been saying, for decades and decades. So it's even though sometimes these ideas are very obscure and seem very marginal, it's worth keeping an eye on, which I know is a very anodyne thing to say, but I'll say it anyway.
I just looked up Erbschleichen on ChatGPT, and the translation they offer is legacy hunter, which I think is a new phrase in English, but it doesn't quite capture the German, I don't think.
That's what I was saying. There's something about Schleichen, which
Schleichen is
sort of extra nefarious.
Exactly, such a word.
Yeah.
It's a secret hunter, right? A secret legacy hunter with the Erb, exactly. Look, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, a really great lecture framing all sorts of things which, as the discussion proved, we really need to think about, and we need to think about very hard indeed. And so I would like you to join me in a torrent of applause for Jan-Werner Müller. And now let us continue.